I'm going to tell you about a remarkable man who led an extraordinary life in this video, which has been sponsored by Audible, but more of that later. His name was John Renton. Well, that was his official name. Actually, almost everyone called him Jack Renton, and he later became known as the White Headhunter. Now, Jack was born in the Orkneys. What's that? You don't know where the Orkneys are? Ah. Fair enough, why should you? Right, the Orkneys are small, windswept islands surrounded by the cold seas north of Britain. And, well, Jack didn't want to spend his entire life there. He wanted to get out there and have adventures and see the world. Well, he certainly had adventures. So he went to Liverpool and signed on to become the crewman of a windjammer. And he went to Hong Kong, and he went to San Francisco, and he got drugged by his landlord. And he woke up with two other Shanghaied men aboard a Boston-registered ship bound for McKeon's Island. Now, McKeon's Island is in the middle of flipping nowhere. It's in the Pacific, about 5,000 miles into the Pacific, and it's tiny. It's only about half a mile wide, and why would anyone want to go to this uninhabited little speck in the middle of nowhere? Well, from the sea, it looks like a normal island, fairly lush. It's surrounded by vegetation, but you only have to walk about 50 yards inland and you come across a weird, lifeless moonscape of poo. That's right, guano. You see, if you are at this small island in the middle of flipping nowhere, then you're going to be very popular with birds who quite like to have a rest every now and again. And so what does a bird do? Well, they poo. And after many centuries of birds landing there and pooing everywhere, tens of feet of guano had built up. And this was actually quite valuable stuff. It was fertilizer. Some people will tell you that it was used for its saltpeter in the manufacture of gunpowder. These people are wrong. There are actually much more efficient ways of getting saltpeter. No, it was just used for fertilizer, but it was really good. And it must have been really good fertilizer, much better than pig or cow dung, which you might think would be perfectly adequate. But it was worthwhile sending ships way out into the middle of nowhere to load up with cargoes of this horrible poo. It was particularly good in enriching the soils of places that had rather weak soils, where you're trying to colonize places in the middle of nowhere where the soils aren't terrific, these desert islands and so forth. Enrich them with guano and maybe you can get a colony running. Well, guano was in demand, and so there were ships that went out to places like McKeon Island. And that was the work they had to do. They went to the island, they landed, they loaded up the ship with guano, holding their noses presumably a lot of the time. And then the bosun of the ship approached Renton and his two Shanghaied colleagues and said, "I don't think this ship is seaworthy. Seriously, I don't think this is going to get to where it's bound. If we get hit by a serious storm or anything like that, I can see this ship going down. It's in terrible condition, and I can't persuade the captain of this. So I don't want to die in a big diluting puddle of poo in the middle of the Pacific. So I reckon the four of us could probably crew a small boat. Why don't we load up one of the ship's small boats and just get out of here? What do you say?" Well, for Renton and his two Shanghaied colleagues, this of course was more than just avoiding the disaster of a potentially unseaworthy ship, but it was also a way of escape. So they were all for it. Now the officers would patrol deck. So it was quite obvious that these officers knew that people might try to desert, and they reckoned they had about a 2-minute gap to load a load of stuff onto one of the boats and get out of there. And this they then did. They didn't have a huge amount of stuff loaded on the boat, but never mind, they could just get out of there quickly. That was the main thing. And for the first 3 days they had a good breeze, and they put a lot of distance between themselves and the ship that they were deserting. Unfortunately, they were then becalmed, and so they then had to row. Their supplies ran out rather quickly, unfortunately, and they started, well, losing weight and getting weaker. The bones started showing through on the rib cages. Now, after drifting for about 17 days, they were so starved that talk turned to cannibalism, and there was a democratic meeting held. Now, you know what democracy is, don't you? Yes, democracy is 5 wolves and a sheep deciding what to have for lunch. So there were 3 Americans and Renton, who was definitely the plumpest. So I think you can guess how that vote went. And it seems that it was just about when they were going in for the kill to kill him that, oh, timely, a tiger shark was sighted. But how to get the tiger shark to come closer to the boat. It was up to Renton again. He sat on the side of the boat and dangled his feet in the water, temptingly. Little small fish came over and nibbled at his toes, but he wasn't interested. He wanted the tiger shark, which eventually came in, and yes, they were able to bash it with oars and club it and stab it with everything they had, and they managed to subdue and finally kill the tiger shark. So, phew, they had some food. They could cut a load of steaks off it and get cooking. They had some cooking gear aboard the boat. And this was fine at first. Phew, what a relief. Got some food in it. Not terribly nice, but hey, it's food. They didn't actually get to eat most of the shark. Most of the shark was eaten by other sharks. They had to lash it to the outside of the boat, and well, other sharks came along and they had most of it. But they were also able to cut a lot of steaks off it and dry them in the sun for use later. Or that would have worked. Would have worked had it then not rained and these dried steaks got wet and then they rotted. But then they were all they had to eat, so they ate the rotten shark steaks and they were horribly, horribly sick, throwing up all over the shop. And they drifted for 35 days. Now there were moments of hope and there were terrifying moments. For instance, they were hit by a storm that raged all through the night and they only had the phosphorescence on the waves to steer by, so they could keep themselves bow onto the waves and avoid being swamped. And that, of course, you imagine, took a huge amount of energy out of them, and so they were exhausted after that. And they would see clouds on the horizon and think, yes, yes, land, let's head towards those clouds. Because if you've got a cloudless sky over a smooth seascape, if you see a cloud, that's a reasonable indicator of land, because the moisture holding water over the warm sea is forced when it comes over the land a bit higher, and then it condenses and perhaps forms a cloud, and that's an indicator. But no, sometimes it's just a cloud. And their hopes were dashed again and again. But after 35 days, they sighted land. Yes, actual land. They could see land. It was just over there. But unfortunately, Renton was the only one who was strong enough to row. The others, all they could do was lie there and hope, presumably shouting the occasional bit of encouragement to Renton, like, row harder. So he rowed towards the island. But then darkness fell before he got there. And it seems that their hopes had been dashed. But then, in the early glimmer of dawn, they were able to see that they hadn't drifted too far. And yes, they were still within sight of that land. And Renton rowed. He rowed towards that land as hard as he possibly could, but it was surrounded by reefs with crashing waves, and even when he found gaps through the reefs, there were strong offshore currents which were pushing him out, and though he tried to row against the currents, they started defeating him. But he gritted his teeth and remembered that he was British and rowed for all he was worth, and still failed to land. He was pushed back out to sea by the offshore currents, and darkness fell again. The next day he was extremely weak, but they were still within sight of land and in sight of... What's this? Now, there are thousands and thousands of islands in the Pacific, but there were 3 in this period that were given a very wide berth by sailors. They were known about. You don't go there because there are cannibals and headhunters and they'll just kill you. But that's just 3 out of thousands. This island was one of those 3. War canoes came out towards them. They were too weak to do anything much. The war canoes came right up to them. The natives, with black teeth, spears and clubs, leapt aboard and just ignored the men and just started looting, seeing what they had first. And then they towed the boat and its contents all the way to the land, dragged it up onto the shore, dumped the men onto the beach, and, I'm guessing to the disappointment of Renton and his colleagues, smashed up the boat. So Renton, seeing them smash up the boat, was... and I'm putting thoughts into his mind here, but I'm just imagining it, thinking something along the lines of, oh great, I'm not going to escape now. Why did the natives smash up the boat? Because the boat was held together with nails, and nails were made out of iron, which was a miracle material, and this was their way of getting hold of some iron. Wow, it's held together with nails, guys! Smash, smash, smash. Great, we got some nails. Oh, sorry, did you want that boat? Bit late now. Now, the emaciated men were so emaciated that people shrank from them in horror. Whew, there's something not quite right about these guys, it seems that they were thinking. But they were curiosities, and people did feed them little tidbits and just tried to see how they would behave. And one man who was particularly nice to them and fed them more than most started in a private moment, signalling to them. Something like that. I can't imagine that. Maybe the thumbs up is not universal. It probably isn't. But he was trying to signal that if you stay here, those people will kill you. Whereas if you come with me in my canoe, maybe you'll live. Renton thought that that was preferable to waiting around and seeing what would happen there. So he got into the man's canoe and was paddled away, leaving the Americans behind. And he was taken to a coastal village not very far away, and he was introduced to his new life. He had actually been bought. He was now a slave of the big man who'd bought them from the people who'd salvaged him from the boat. And this was to be his life for, well, he didn't know how long, and neither will you until I later tell you. It was a sort of a feudal society. There were these big men, as they were called, sort of a bit like chieftains, but it wasn't such an official hereditary title like that. They were just powerful men who, through general success in their lives and a strong network of obligations, got a lot of people supporting them. And this big man, Kubu, had a prize. He had Renton, he had a white man, and all the skills and mystique and kudos that goes with that. A good talented slave can be a very valuable thing, and an exotic slave, well, will be the talk of the village, forest, bush, whatever. I was going to say talk of the town, but it wasn't really a town. There were, off the coast, lots of small artificial islands, and these were inhabited by the dispossessed, slaves, runaways, people who were escaping from feuds and so forth. And the minimum size was 3 huts, one for the man, one for his family, and one for his fishing kit, which gives you some idea of the order of precedence and importance in this society. The biggest dwellings were, the biggest built up areas, if you like, were about 200 people within a stockade, but quite often it was just 3 huts on a little island. Anyway, that was where he was, and it was a feudal society in that it was slave owning, and you had these obligations, and they also went on raids against the bush people of the interior, as well as rival villages along the coast. It was quite a different world he was brought into. He was rather shy. They were largely naked most of the time, and he didn't like to take his clothes off, particularly not his trousers. And in fact, they didn't get him to take his trousers off until they gave him his own pool to bathe in. But he made himself reasonably popular. One of the things that he did a lot was play with the kids. Now, I imagine that's always a good way to ingratiate yourself with a new society. Play with the kids, and he taught them football. Would you believe? And in about 6 months, he learnt the language. Although I imagine that if you learn the language largely through talking to kids, maybe you then sound like a child when you speak, which maybe added to the charm. Anyway, it seems that he won people over. He ended up becoming the cook to about 5 local, quite powerful men. He didn't like being a cook, though. He wanted to be something bigger, better, and more useful than that. Why were these islands quite so hostile? Well, one of the reasons was things that had happened 200 years ago. The first people to get there in the 1500s, about the 1560s, were the Spanish. And the Spanish were there to get gold because they'd heard rumours, supposedly they were told by other islanders who were perhaps, I don't know, trying to get rid of them, oh yeah, there's lots of gold in islands that are that way, could you please go now? So they named them the Solomon Islands because of King Solomon's mines, right? Because there's gold there, so they believed, wrongly. But the idea was lodged in their heads, and so Spanish sent out expeditions that were largely composed of soldiers. They were going to go out there, conquer an area, mine gold and get rich and bat aside anyone who tried to stop them. They introduced disease. One of the reasons that sailors spread disease quite so effectively is that they were not exactly the elites of their society. People who volunteer to go on these god-awful voyages in these horrendous, cramped, uncomfortable, I mean, the ships of the period were just not pleasant places to be in, and you'd be in there with no women for many, many months, years even, and you're quite likely to die out there. And there's no sunblock, you know, so you could get terrible sunburn. So They weren't exactly the elites of their societies. They were quite often the diseased dregs of society. And so they became associated with death. They killed people to get the gold, which wasn't there, and they introduced disease, and they had guns, and so where the Spanish went also death. And then but when the Spanish went back to Spain, their grasp of longitude was so bad that on their maps these islands were placed 2,000 miles out. That's a massive navigation error. By the 1790s, the British were turning up because by that stage they had the Harrison watch. Now the Harrison watch was essentially a very accurate watch, and it solved the problem of longitude. There was a prize offered. This is a big story on its own, actually. But essentially, a lot of people were saying they should do it by observations of the sun or the planets and so forth. But trying to do that from the deck of a moving ship is very difficult. And anyway, accurate watches turned out to be the solution to the longitude problem. And so a British ship came along, but that didn't go entirely well because. Well, the British ship got attacked by war canoes because they all remembered the Spanish, and the British ship had lots of cannons on, and so the British ship defended itself, boom, and you can imagine that's no great way to ingratiate yourself either. And so they weren't tremendously in favour. And then for the next 30 years, it was whalers coming along. And again, whalers, they're not the nicest, best people to encounter in the world. The sort of people who end up on whaling ships are not the elite, educated, well-meaning classes generally. They're the dregs of society who end up on the whaling ships. So that largely explains the degree of hostility to the white man. Now, this feudal society with their black teeth, by the way, the black teeth, the natives had black teeth because they went to an awful lot of effort to get black teeth. It wasn't that their teeth had rotted because they didn't look after them. No, they actually mixed up a paste and put it on the teeth, and then they had to have their mouths propped open for this stuff to dry on their teeth for like 3 or 4 days to stain the teeth black. I have no reason to believe that Renton stained his teeth black, so he would have been an exception. It was a place they had guard owls that were trained to hoot if enemies were sighted, and they had animism. They were particularly into spirits. The Nanu. Your Nanu was a spirit. Oh, I didn't say, when the men were brought ashore in the first place, they slept for a full day and a full night. And one possible explanation that enters my head is something else I learned about these people, which is that they believe that you should never shake someone awake, because the Nanu, your spirit, your soul, if you like, that's in you, it leaves your body when you're asleep, because that's what dreams are. So if someone were to shake you awake, they wake your body when your spirit was away, and the two would be separated, and that would be a disaster. So instead what you do is you speak the person's name, and if they don't stir, you just leave them. But if they do stir, that's because the Nanu heard its name and returned to the body, and then you wake up safely. But of course the natives wouldn't have known these Renton or his colleagues' names, so they just left them there. Perhaps that's the reason. Or maybe it was just laziness. Anyway, so there's Renton, and he's trying to make himself useful in this strange world and get used to all the customs. And there are an awful lot of customs. There is a correct way of doing absolutely everything. How do you hold a spear in the presence of a superior, an inferior, a family member, someone who lent you that spear, and so forth? There's a particular way of doing absolutely everything. In some ways, though, it was quite a free society. They believed that there was a god, and that the god created the world, and that the god created the etiquette, the rituals, the way of doing everything, and that god then sat back because, job was done. He didn't need people to serve him or worship him. He didn't need worshippers because he's a god, and he didn't need anyone to serve him because that's what dead people do. The spirits of the dead serve the god. The living don't. I mean, we don't do him. Where is he? We can't see him anywhere. There's nothing. No, we're not serving him. So we're free to do whatever we like, really. They were very friendly, these people. However, they were very friendly because they lived in a world with a constant fear of savage retribution. whenever they lost hairs or they clipped their nails or they excreted, they would be very careful to gather up everything and make sure that nobody else got hold of it. In every house there was an incinerator for burning nail clippings and hair and poo and just everything. Poo apparently was particularly important. You don't want someone to get hold of a bit of you, particularly not your poo, because what they could do to curse you was take a bit of you to one of their ancestral heads, speak your name and get the ancestral head to curse you, and then something bad would happen to you, and everything bad that happened to anyone, absolutely regardless, was somebody's fault. If a coconut landed on someone's head, somebody was responsible and someone will get blamed. It seems that their beliefs, the natives' beliefs in these things, was so powerful that if someone had been named in a ceremony as guilty for some reason of something, they would just collapse with shame and perhaps not eat and starve and wither away to death. Renton himself wrote a memoir, and in the memoir he's a bit contradictory. Sometimes he says that, I don't believe a word of it, it's just a load of superstitious nonsense. But he also recorded having seen lights leave a dead body and then go into one of the huts, and then he heard screams coming from that hut. So did he believe this stuff or didn't he? Difficult to say. But why would you want to be a headhunter? Why would you want these ancestral heads? Well, because the head was the seat of mana, M-A-N-A, mana. It's a fairly common oceanic word, which means sort of the power, if you like, of your soul, of your life essence or whatever, and it resided in the head. And if you could kill people and take their heads, then you could give your chieftain that head, and the chieftain with loads of heads would have all the mana of all those defeated enemies and would become so much more powerful as a result. People started confiding in Renton. He seemed to be the go-to man if you had something to admit to. Why did they confide in Renton? Because he had no ancestral head. He was safe to confide in because he couldn't curse you. He had no power, he had no mana, he had no heads. You see, so it was safe to tell him stuff. So that was another way, perhaps, that he made himself popular. He was the guy to tell your secrets to. And he couldn't tell anyone else because, well, he didn't speak the languages of the other islands. He only speaks ours. So Renton made himself pretty useful, and he noticed that he noted a number of things. He noticed, for instance, that there were some really quite good mortise and tenon joints and dovetail joints and drilled holes with pegs in the carpentry in the houses where he lived. But in other villages, everything was just lashed together with ropes. Why was that then? Eventually he found out. 40 years before him, another white man had been shipwrecked there and had ended up becoming a slave like Renton in this same village. And he had great carpentry skills, and that explained all this carpentry. He had revolutionized carpentry in the region and made quite a name for himself. So much so that other villages thought, well, actually, we'd quite like this guy because he seems pretty ace. And another village made a better offer. Come to us and we won't treat you like a slave. We'll give you better food and you won't be a slave. And it'll be great. Come to us. He got a better offer. So he thought, great, I got a better offer. I'm making my way in the world. Okay, fair enough. The trouble was that led to a huge amount of loss of face for the village. But they came up with a solution. They ambushed him and killed him. There you go. So they didn't lose face. They didn't have the carpenter anymore, but nobody else did either. So that was fair. On learning this, you can imagine that Renton was a little concerned. So I can't even escape through making my way in the world in the normal way. I can't, there's no sort of social advancement here. I'm more stuck than even I previously thought. Now, they were raiders, these people. They would go on raids in war canoes, typically holding about 40 men. And the preparations for these were pretty nasty. One of the things they do is sacrifice someone and put them in an uncorked canoe and wait for the body to ooze various oozings, and these would drip out of the canoe and be caught in a tray, and then they would then make arrowheads which were designed specifically to break off in a wound, and they would dip these in the ooze, which would then be, this was biological warfare, you could get tetanus and all sorts of nasties off that, and this was part of their preparation for going to war. Now, he helped, that is Renton helped in the making of one of the canoes. It took him 2 months. He didn't actually know what the canoe was for, but he was pretty alarmed when it came to inaugurate the launching of this canoe. There was a big feast, okay, nothing too alarming so far, and then everyone gathered, and a man dressed in a sort of fish costume appeared, and everyone showed fear. And it didn't look like it was mocking the ritual fear. This looked like actual fear of this guy. They shrank back in terror, but they also watched, fascinated, as he walked around the press of people, and then eventually picked out a slave girl, who was then immediately set upon and killed by the crowd. She was the sacrifice for this new war canoe. And Renton, it is reasonable to imagine, thought, okay, right, these people are just nuts. I've got to get out of here. But how? They won't allow me to go. But he saw an opportunity, because there was a big feast that night for the ceremony of the launching of the canoe, and at that time he thought, right, if I steal a little fishing canoe, I can put some stuff aboard it and paddle away to somewhere else. There must be a trading station. There must be a trading station, because a while ago I was on a logging expedition and someone put a steel axe into my hand. Where the hell did that come from? They must have some trading connection with other islands. There must be a trading post somewhere that trades indirectly with this place. If I can find that trading post, it can't be very far away, then maybe I'll be able to wait there until a ship comes along. And I don't know, I'll work it out when I get there, but I need to get to that sort of place. So we thought, right, what do I put? So we put a club and 6 spears and some food, and he didn't have much time. He packed his little canoe and set off into the darkness. Now he knew roughly where to go to get to this trading post, but he also knew that he would have to get past an enemy rival village. An enemy rival village, how was he going to do this? Well, he was just going to have to paddle very, very hard. He would have to get all the way past it at night. You might think, well, then you just go out to sea. Well, you don't want to go straight out to sea, because you have no idea where you are. Once this is at night, don't forget. He'll just get lost, and that's not going to work. Besides, there's a reef that's almost impenetrable that goes around the main island. There's a channel only about 100 yards wide. He's going to have to stick to that. No, he's just going to have to paddle and get past that rival village, and then maybe find a break in the reef, and then break out in daylight to the other island where there is, all going well, this trading post. So he paddled all night, but when the light came up, he found that he was short of his target. Ahead of him still was the enemy village. How was he going to get past? Well, he thought, maybe I just brass it out. I've got long hair now, I'm very tanned from a distance, I could pass for a native. I'm just a bloke in a canoe. Maybe if I just paddle, saunter by. They're just going about their normal activities in the morning. They won't have any particular reason to be looking out for me. I think I could probably get away with it, and it's my best chance, and I can't think of anything else to do, and I can't go back. I can't go back because they kill people for just even changing jobs. But the idea of leaving the village without permission when I'm a slave, and I've just stolen someone's boat and all this kit, they will definitely kill me if I go back. So there's only forwards now. Okay, so he tries to get past. It seems to be going well at first, but then he loses his nerve. But he sees a mangrove swamp. Right, I'll hide in there. Maybe no one saw me. I can wait in there, and then maybe I can wait all day and then strike out tomorrow and give it another go. Right, so I'll do that. But no, he heard the blast of a war conch and war canoes being launched. That was quick, he thought. And he soon heard voices shouting into the mangrove swamp, "Come out or we'll come in and kill you." So he came out, and they dragged him out of his little canoe, and they took him to the beach, and they threw him down onto the beach, and they clubbed him. some while later, he awoke to find himself lying on the beach, very thoroughly tied up, at the feet of a lot of natives who were very heavily armed, who were talking about killing him. This was not a good moment, but it's a great moment to break for like the message of my sponsor, which is Audible. Now, Audible, just in case you don't know, is a massive website which sells audiobooks. And if you were to be so cunning as to type in www.audible.com/Lindybeige or text Lindybeige to 500 500, then you could take advantage of an offer they have, which is a 30-day free trial and one free book that's yours to own forever. Indeed, all the books that you get through Audible are yours forever to keep. It's like buying a book; it's yours. It's not a streaming service. It's not that you're not renting. It's that you own the stuff that you buy. And whilst you're a member, you get 30% off purchase of other books, and there's some occasional free book. Anyway, you can get one free book if you go to www.audible.com/Lindybeige or text Lindybeige to 500 500. And one book there I noticed which caught my eye is Mutiny on the Bounty. Paradise in Chains, actually. So Paradise in Chains is the main title. Mutiny on the Bounty and the Founding of Australia. Now, you've probably heard of Mutiny on the Bounty, and you've probably heard a lot of rubbish that isn't true. They keep making films about it that are historically very inaccurate. They will always tell you that Fletcher Christian was just such a hero and Captain Bligh was nothing but a puffed up villain, whereas in fact Fletcher Christian, if historical evidence is to be used instead, was a bit of a git actually, and Captain Bligh was a very long-serving, successful sea captain who couldn't possibly have had the very long and successful career that he had and earned the respect of so many people that he did if he'd been just a puffed-up villain. Anyway, so you could listen to that book and learn far more about Mutiny on the Bounty and all that goes with it, and the founding of Australia, which will also be a little bit more relevant when you listen to some of the stuff that I got to say in a moment. So, there you go. Now back to the story. Now, there's our man lying on the beach thinking, well, this is it then. I'm wondering exactly what method they're going to have of killing me. But then he heard that they were also discussing an alternative to killing him, which was ransoming him. And he heard more canoes turn up. Oh, maybe I'm valuable enough that they're going to try to sell me to somebody else, maybe? There was a parley happening in canoes offshore. And there was just a little glimmer of hope. Maybe someone else will come along and take me away from all this, because otherwise I'm certainly dead, aren't I? Well, he was grabbed and unceremoniously dumped at the feet of Kaboo. Yes, the big man from the village who owned him already. Yeah, the man he was trying to escape from, he's dumped at his feet, and Kaboo does not look happy. He is loaded onto a canoe and paddled away in silence. It's a long paddle back to the village. The silence was terrible, and yet punctuated by giggles. Did he just hear a giggle then? No, that wasn't a giggle. More silence. That was definitely a giggle that time. But this went unexplained. They took him all the way back to the village, and he thought, right, well, I can't escape now. So again, I'm just going to be killed by different people. And he was put on his feet in front of everyone who was smiling and laughing and cheering and waving and so forth. And Kaboo looked rather, well, if anything, happy. And he was freed of his bonds. And Kaboo then made a speech saying that they had built this war canoe to go on a raid against that other village, which of course was why the village was on high alert, because it's a bit of a dead giveaway, isn't it, if you do a massive ceremony saying we're about to go raiding and you're the next. But anyway, so that was one of the reasons Renton was spotted so quickly. And I've just been told that they thought that he just found out yesterday he found out that the 3 white men that were left back at that other village all died. We, of course, were going to toughen him up. Toughen him up by sending him on a raid with us. He was going to come in our canoe. But that wasn't enough for our Jack Renton. Oh no, no. On learning that his 3 colleagues had been killed, he set off for vengeance on his own. Yes, he took 6 spears and a club and he canoed straight to their village. Even the night before we were going to raid it, he had to get there first. This man is a hero. Close shave, yeah? Close shave. So he was now welcomed back into the bosom of the village. He was still a slave, but now he was a hero slave with people patting him on the back and showing him so much more respect. Wow, what a guy. He was going to take vengeance for 3 people all on his own against an entire village. Whew, this man, Renton, is clearly someone to be reckoned with. Maybe he'd make a good headhunter. Kubu had decided that he had no intention of paying the ransom that he had promised to pay for Renton. Instead, he was going to raid that village because you know what that village had said to him? Take this hothead back, they'd said, and teach him how to fight. Okay, let's teach him how to fight. Now, Renton was not terribly skilled, but he was big and muscular, and so it was thought that he'd make a good spearman. Essentially, they had 2 troop types, spearmen and archers. The archers, incidentally, had no fletchings on their arrows, which I find really odd because you'd think that's a really easy thing to invent, and you'd only have to, one person would have to work out fletchings, and you think that the idea that if you stick fletchings on your arrows would spread like wildfire really quickly, and then everyone would have fletchings on their arrows. But no, even though it was their prime missile weapon, they had no fletchings on their arrows, so their arrows weren't really very accurate. And I saw a documentary a few years ago about very similar tribesmen from Vanuatu, and they had no fletchings on their arrows. Today, they had no fletchings on their arrows, and they were taken to an archery club in Britain and shown that if you stick fletchings on the arrows, they go straight. And they saw this, and oh yeah, they go straight. I mean, you would think that... But anyway, they had no fletchings on their arrows. The spearmen were armed with a few spears, a club, and a 4-foot rectangular shield in the left hand. And so those are the 2 troop types. And they practiced. They rehearsed for battle. They had cork-tipped spears and cork-tip arrows and so forth for mock battles. But this was battle practice, which struck Renton as a little bit odd because he'd never actually known, in all the stories he'd heard, he'd never actually heard of a pitched battle. Raids were almost always orchestrated so that the attackers would attack in overwhelming numbers, or it would be an ambush or something. There were reports by other anthropologists in these same islands of seeing small sleeping villages being attacked by vast numbers of troops who would just go in and club all the men and steal all the women. Well, anyway, they trained for battle, and he was put into a canoe, given 3 bodyguards to make absolutely sure that he lived, because they couldn't live with the loss of face if their star man went down in this raid that was being put on for his benefit and in vengeance for his friends, because this guy's one of us now. So if he's one of us, those guys, they're sort of one of us, so we owe him vengeance for them. The group avenges the individual. Let's do this. So off they went. 3 war canoes of 40 men. Lots of men paddling and 1 steersman in each one. When they got there, 6 novices were left behind to guard the canoes. That's presumably 2 per canoe. 20 men were given the task of stealing the enemy's canoes, thus cutting off their retreat, and the rest killing. And in they went, and Renton was with the killing group. The accounts of this raid say that one man held 20 of theirs at bay just with an aggressive glare, which actually I find perfectly believable. I can believe that would work. It didn't work for very long. Someone sneaked up behind him and that was the end of him. But for a while he held 20 back just by looking at them in a "come on then, I know something you don't" sort of way. The raid was very successful, and they got their loot and they went back home having shown that lot, given them a lesson. These were not wars of conquest. These were wars of vengeance. Generally, there was a constant low-level war of feuds and counter-feuds going on, and these would drag on for ages until the amount of killing was about equal on the 2 sides, and then that was when wars tended to fizzle out. So the raid was successful, and so now, hooray! He's the hero of the hour. A letter arrived. A letter arrived for Renton. It had taken many months to get to him. Nobody in the area read or even really understood what writing was, or even most of them believed in writing. Renton would tell stories about his life in the bigger, wider world, and almost nobody believed him. With one exception, he had a chaperone called Quaisula, and the chaperone did sort of believe him, although not completely, because the chaperone interestingly thought, well, okay, if this is all true then, how do you make iron? He couldn't understand. Why don't you tell us how you make iron? Because the world they were from was a world in which absolutely everything that was made, people knew how to make. If you had a bow, people knew how to make bows. Spears, people knew how to make spears. Huts, people knew how to make huts. So if he was from the world of iron, he would know how to make iron, because people know how to make everything, don't they? The concept of there being things in the world that you didn't know how to make, but you just accepted that somehow somebody else made them and then you bought them off them, was alien. They also had some strange ideas about the white man. For instance, why is he trading? Why does he come here in these ships and trade? Well, the explanation is quite simple. He has no land of his own, so he's forced to roam the seas in these boats and to trade for stuff all the time, because he has no... If you had land, you'd live on the land, surely, wouldn't you? You'd do that, and then you'd be happy doing that, wouldn't you? These white men are different. Anyway, Quaisula learned a little bit of English and became very firm friends with Renton. They were very similar in a lot of ways, similar height and build, and similar intelligence and humour and so forth. They became very firm friends, and a certain amount of trust was built up with Quaisula. Now, sandalwood. Sandalwood logging was coming to an end. That was one of the big trades in the area. There were sandalwood ships, but the area was now largely logged out of sandalwood. So there were these ships then that needed something else to do, and they started recruiting. Why were they recruiting? Because Australia had demand for labourers. During the American Civil War, the price of cotton shot through the roof. I think you can understand why, and so it became very lucrative to grow cotton in places like Australia. And cotton's reasonably easy to grow, but sugarcane, which was another thing they had to go at growing, is much more difficult and very labour intensive. And they just couldn't get the workers. The white men in Australia just wouldn't work for those sort of low wages and nasty conditions and long contracts. But maybe they could get recruits from places like the Solomon Isles. So recruitment ships, ex-sandalwood ships, were sent out to recruit. They were called recruitment ships, and a lot of them did indeed recruit. What some of them did, though, was something that became known as blackbirding. It was recruiting in that you were getting workers aboard your ship, but it wasn't voluntary. It was done by force or by trickery. And the process of blackbirding went on for long enough that something like 4,000 Solomon Islanders were blackbirded over a 5-year period between about 1865 and 1870. Nobody knows exactly what the total numbers of people blackbirded are, but reasonably large. And I don't want you to think, by the way, that, oh, people were different then, it was accepted behaviour. No, it wasn't. These people were scoundrels, and it was known that they were scoundrels. There were all sorts of regulations and inspectors put in place to make sure that they didn't flout the regulations. There was a system in place. There were laws. You were not supposed to do this. And when some of the sea captains flouted those laws, and horror stories about some of the things that they did became known, the British public were absolutely baying for these sea captains' blood. It was an outrage. So don't try to excuse this with, people were different back then. No. Some of these guys, some of these blackbirders were absolute out-and-out villains. For instance, there was Henry Ross Lewin, who one of the things he liked to do was pretend to be a bishop, and he would invite people onto his ship because he knew that missionaries were quite respected, and then sail off with them. Yeah, that was one of his favourite tactics. So, and regulations like how many people you could put on a ship and how much space each passenger had to have, these regulations were set down in law, and there were inspectors, but he just flouted the regulations. Worse, though, was another captain called James Murray. He was a doctor, Dr. James Murray, who was known for, amongst other things, drugging his patients for his own nefarious ends. And he was an absolute maniac, this guy. He would, for instance, set out trade goods on the deck of his ship, and people would canoe out from their islands to have a look at the goods, and then he would hold some goods out over the edge of his ship and then let them drop, and it would be full of pig iron, which would then smash through the canoe, capsizing it, and perhaps killing a few people whilst this was happening. And then he would, oh no, oh what a terrible accident, rescue the people out of the water and then sail off with them. I mean, this guy's a maniac. I mean, some of the accounts said that he would occasionally just kill some of the passengers on board for the hell of it. And you can't put it down to racism, because he was being horrendous with everybody. He would, for instance, he advertised at one point, he advertised for pioneers to go and colonize an island in the Pacific, and he got a load of people on his ship, and then after getting off out to sea, he said, oh, what we're actually doing is recruiting. Sorry, we're what? We're not what? He would just trick anyone into doing what he wanted. On one voyage, he put some passengers aboard his ship because it lent an air of respectability and legitimacy to what he was doing. Oh, I'm a passenger carrier. Oh, yes, you'll have to stroll about deck. We'll serve you tea. And having sailed away, these passengers were of no longer use to him, and so he abandoned them on an island. When another ship came by later, it was found that all the men had been killed by the natives. The guy was an absolute maniac. The voyage that actually was the beginning of the end for this was the voyage of a ship called the Perry. The Perry set off from Fiji with lots of people aboard, including lots of these blackbirded workers who really did not want to be there. And they rebelled and they took over the ship. Now, on the previous occasion, when a lot of natives were taken over the ship, they just killed everyone, but then they had no one who could sail the ship. And so that didn't end well for them. But these were slightly cleverer. They killed everyone apart from one Fijian sailor, who then threw himself overboard. So the result was the same. Most of the people being killed had no idea why they were being killed. They didn't know anything about the circumstances of these natives. They'd seen plenty of natives aboard ships before, and it had never been a problem before, so they just thought there were more native workers going back and forth between their various native islands. But no, these guys had been blackbirded and they wanted out. Then what happened aboard the Perry is the stuff of absolute nightmares. It was a very long, they drifted for I think 35 days, about 1,800 miles. They were from lots of different islands. They spoke different languages, and some of they divided amongst tribal lines, and some of these tribes were quite well armed and others weren't, which you can imagine was not so good for the ones who weren't terribly well armed. And they started running out of food after a while, and cannibalism became rife, but you weren't supposed to eat members of your own tribe. So if you had weapons, you could then eat members of another tribe, but if you didn't have weapons, you could then have to break a taboo, which is another oceanic word, and eat one of your own, which you didn't want to. It was horrendous. It then came across HMS Basilisk. Now there's a hell of a name, HMS Basilisk. What a great name for a ship, I think. And they were rescued and taken on board, but no one spoke their language, and they were treated as well as they could be treated, and they were fed and so forth, but no one could talk to them. They didn't really know what the hell was going on, but they could see from looking at the ship that something utterly horrendous had happened. And they took them back to Fiji, which seemed a reasonable thing to do. Except when these blackbirded men saw that they were back where they started, back on Fiji, they thought, oh, okay, right, so, we've killed all these people, we've escaped, and they're going to kill us. So they ran for it. An interpreter was sought and found. The men were tracked down and given huge amounts of compensation. They were completely bewildered. They thought they were all going to be killed, and then suddenly the white men starts handing them loads and loads of stuff, including really good stuff like axes. A steel axe was just about the most prized thing in Renton's village. A steel axe, wow! Steel axe was like 20 times more efficient than a stone axe. It took to chop down a big tree where Renton was took 4 days with a stone axe. Wow, steel axe. And then they were giving them rifles, but not just, not old-fashioned muskets. They were giving them Snyder rifles. Holy cow, why are they giving us all this stuff? Anyway, eventually it was explained to them that the guy who blackbirded them was a criminal. And, the white men do have laws. Anyway, so when the Voyage of the Perry became well known, there was another big public outcry and a big crackdown. Some of the things which turned out to be maybe not misguided. It's too big a topic really to deal with in this video. The Australians started banning the selling of guns to natives, and they also tried later banning headhunting. Anyway, blackbirding eventually came to an end, thank goodness. But it's relevant. Wow, it was one hell of a digression. It was relevant to this video because it's in this time that blackbirding is happening. Now, after another successful raid, Kubu is worried because the enemy is starting to get hold of rifles. The standard contract, by the way, was you work for 3 years in Australia and then you go home with good compensation, including very often a rifle. And he thought, right, we need some rifles because if they try to get vengeance for what we've just done, they're likely to take vengeance using rifles. So we better get some rifles quick. So I can use my influence to get permission to cull porpoises. And with a porpoise cull, we can get loads of porpoise teeth, and then we'll be able to trade those for rifles. Yeah, this is my plan. Let's do it. So they put stones into bamboo sticks and beat the surface of the water and drove a load of porpoises into the shallows, and then sang to them and were really nice to them and led them to the shore where the women were waiting there with hidden knives behind their backs, and then the deed was done. So they had lots of porpoise teeth, and they took an expedition out to this extraordinary place that was a manageable journey away, where a very, very fat chieftain who must have looked quite a character. He wore an English stovepipe hat and a German naval jacket and nothing else. And he lived in these, you could call them tree houses, but they were more like forts really. They were over 100 feet high up in the trees, and they had really thick floors that were musket proof. So they were treehouse cum fortresses, if you like, and eventually they got up into one of these houses and they were able to talk to him. But there were problems. You see, this guy was now doing really well trading with the white man, and porpoise teeth, he had no use for porpoise teeth. The white man's not interested in porpoise teeth. He wants stuff that he can use to trade with the white man. And his currency was people. And when he clapped eyes on Renton, shing, he thought, wow, this Renton guy is going to be worth a mint. Renton found that this chieftain, this fat stovepipe hat wearing chieftain, spoke English. And he started conversing with him in English and striking a deal that he'll come back in a week, arrange for a ship. In a week's time, I'll come back, I'll get on the ship, you'll get loads of compensation, it'll be a sweet deal, can we do this? Unfortunately, Kwaisula overheard and knew enough English that he understood that some deal was being struck and that Renton was trying to escape, and he tipped off Kubu. So Renton realised, I'm going to have to get out really, really quick. I can't hang about. Kubu's not going to give me permission. He wrote a message on a plank of wood, which somehow he was able to get to some British naval crew, that said, I've been stranded here for 5 years. He'd actually been stranded there for 7.5 years, which shows that, hey, time flies when you're headhunting. But I suppose, it's a tropical area of the world. He was used to seasons. So, anyway, he was 2.5 years out, how long he'd been there. And a meeting for the next day was set up. But he couldn't get away from Kubu. Kubu wouldn't let him go, and wouldn't let him go alone, and no one would go with him, not even Kwaisula. And there was a tense moment with the ship there. He's trying to strike a deal with the chieftain, trying to strike a deal with his owner, trying to strike a deal. He saw an opportunity. At one moment, he just got close enough to the ship, and he just leapt onto the side of the board of the ship and scrambled up the side and was onto the deck into the welcoming arms of Royal Navy personnel. He had, it seemed, finally escaped. The next day, Kubu met him and did not recognise him. He'd had his hair cut, he was wearing clothes, he stood differently, and he was speaking in English with the other Englishmen. He just seemed to be one of them. Who was this man? Kubu didn't recognise him. He went off to Australia and was able to sell his story to the newspapers, and he got a job as a recruiter. Yeah, you might not think he would go into that line of work, but he did. And he was actually a very good recruiter who changed the way recruiting was done. He said, for instance, no, you've got to compensate the chieftains. They're sending out all their worst guys because they don't want to lose any of their guys. They certainly don't want to lose their best guys. You've got to give the chieftains really good compensation. Then they're going to be happy to deal with you. See, in our culture, we think if you're interviewing someone for a job, you're just dealing with that person. You don't have to deal with that person's chief or mother or whatever. You're just dealing with that person. But it's different in these islands. He said, okay, you've got to do things differently. People started doing things his way, and it all started working a bit better. But interestingly, he never went back to recruit on his own island. Why is this? Well, we don't know, but it's reasonable to speculate that he was ashamed of some of the things that he might have done on that island. You see, his account doesn't tally brilliantly with the oral history account, which is quite a good oral history account. And the oral history account says that he went on at least 6 raids and killed quite a few people and had a wife. And it's reasonable to imagine that he didn't want the civilized world finding out about those aspects of his story, and that is perhaps why he avoided going back to his own island. Oral history, for instance, I should explain another digression. Here it comes. Oral history was actually far more efficient than you might imagine. You may think that there's Chinese whispers happening all the time. This story just gets banded about and people tell this story over and over again, elaborating it, simplifying it, making it more convenient, getting it to fit with other stories and so forth. That's not how they did it. They took oral history far more seriously than that. A grandparent would tell a grandchild, skipping a generation. Therefore, you have a smaller number of iterations, well, half the number of iterations doing it that way. They would pick the most intelligent grandchild, and in a ceremony they would tell that grandchild the definitive version of the story, and they would do it in the presence of the skull of the person being talked about or some other ancestor who also knew the story. So it was very important to get things right in front of the skull because the spirits would be listening. And then that grandchild would be the sole owner of that story and would have the official version that was just one copy removed from the actual happening. And though that owner of the story might tell loads of other people, whenever the official version is sought, they would go back to that owner of the story. So the records were good enough to recreate entire genealogical records going back a few generations, quite a few generations. Anyway, the two don't quite match up, the oral history and Renton's account. Anyway, Renton became quite successful, and he earned enough money to get passage back to Britain. And there he was celebrated. He didn't have to look for work for a year. But he was actually quite shy and publicity. He avoided publicity a lot and he hated public speaking, didn't want to do that. He did go back to the Orkneys. His own family did not recognize him. He was sighted doing something very strange. When he would go for a swim, which off the Orkneys is brave, he would lie down on the surface of the water and crawl along the top of it in this very strange manner. You see, something they get wrong in a lot of movies is that a lot of swimming strokes that we think are just like standard normal are actually quite recent, at least recent in the world of the white man. The first crawl, as far as I know, that was ever witnessed in Britain was in 1844 in London. Some American Indians were doing not a crawl quite as we know it today, the kick was different and so forth, but a splashy version of that sort of thing. And though it was quite fast, it wasn't taken up. And this business where you put your head under the water and come up and the head down for a few strokes and then come up again, that's a modern thing as well. You look at a film of even Olympic contenders from the early days of the Olympics, and they swam head up. Anyway, so Renton, it seems, was the first white man in Britain or Europe ever to swim the crawl, but his crawl didn't catch on. Instead, another man called Frank Wickham, who was a very similar man to Renton, he was also shipwrecked in the Solomon Islands about 20 years after Renton, and he also became quite a success. He married a local woman, he had a son called Alec, and he traded, got rich enough through trading that he was able to send Alec to boarding school in Australia. And Alec went out there and boy, could that kid swim! He represented Australia in swimming. He held the record that stood until World War One. He also had the high diving record until he broke his neck, but it wasn't fatal, but at the end of his high diving. He also introduced skin diving to Australia. And it was his crawl, later to be called the Australian crawl, that actually caught on. But Renton was there first, swimming the crawl. And anyway, so I better wrap this story up because the digressions are really mounting up now, aren't they? So Renton still had itchy feet, and he went back. He went back to the Pacific, and he became a recruiter again. Obviously, he wasn't content with life back in the Orkneys. Quite a bit colder, for one thing. And one day, he was in a boat that was meant to be covering another boat. The standard process was you sent one boat in to do the deal, whilst another boat hung back a bit with a load of guys with guns in it to make sure that everything's going to go off safely. But the natives were signalling to his boat to go over there and join them. And Renton was looking at these natives and seeing how they were signalling to each other and seeing how he could see that actually that guy is in charge, not that guy who's doing the talking. And he could understand some of the words being said. And he said, no, don't go over. They're spoiling for a fight. They just want to fight. Seriously, they're just about to kick off. Don't go over there. And Renton was told not to be such an old woman. And the boat went over there. It was an ambush. A fight ensued. Some people got away, but Renton didn't. Renton was killed. When news of Renton's death reached the village where Kaboo lived, there was tremendous mourning. There was great wailing. 300 pigs were sacrificed in his honour, and for 3 days straight they told tales of the White Headhunter, Jack Renton. And there was a reliquary house built for him that acted as a shrine to his memory. You can't see it today because it burnt down in 1963. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. I give you the extraordinary tale of Jack Renton. Lindybeige!